So can you hear me now? Okay, sorry, because I was saying things and people are not responding. So my bad. Sorry for that. Okay. So hello everyone. Again. Yeah, if you haven't already, could you please mark your attendance and also turn on your canvas for attendance, and then feel free in the middle to turn it off unless you're participating. So yeah, hi Natalie, Emily, Ariana, Elwin, Josephine, Ray, Sydney, Kate, Jaylin, Rhonda. Okay, well, we okay. All right. Um, so today, good thing is, uh, so this week's content will be simpler than last week's content. Last week we talked about um, how to propose logical arguments. We talked about causality in research. We talked about theoretical paradigms. So I would admit it was a little bit tense, especially in the second week of the semester. But this week is going to be much like a little bit or much simpler, depending on how you see it. So we're going to talk about literature review. So if you remember, I outlined what the components of an academic article looks like, especially an academic article in the empirical sense. So it has this structure: abstract, introduction, lit review, method, results, discussion, limitations and implications, and then reference section. But that's also true of any article. And so this week we're going to focus on those two parts, particularly the literature review part. Introduction, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on introduction, but I guess you know what an introduction is or what the function of introductions in articles. So introduction, at least the way I see it, has three main functions. You probably have heard them in English 101 or like any English composition course you've taken. The first introduction has to grab the attention of the reader. So if you recall, maybe in high school or in freshman year, you write an essay and then you start it with like a story or like some poetry or like some famous quote or like by like a parable, like anything that can get the readers engaged. And similar but not quite the same, we do this thing in research articles as well. So imagine you're investigating something related to diet and exercise. So following, let's say, lifestyle influences and the effect of that on the dieting behavior of followers. Okay. And so when you start writing the introduction, you just don't really start with what your hypothesis is or what your results are. So first of all, people don't understand the context yet, and you need to like lay the groundwork for what you're going to talk about. Like that's what introduction do. So you can start by like talking about lifestyle influencers in general and how they have been rising in terms of numbers and influence uh, on social media and even moving into mainstream media, like how much money is being spent, let's say, for example, on dieting and exercise, how much money these influencers are making, maybe with partnerships, depending on the angle that you're positioning your article at, right? Um, so yeah, you start with like some general statements or like some basic statements. So you can cite some stats in the introduction, saying yeah, like he's the average number of followers for a lifestyle influencer, like major celebrities who went into this lifestyle, like diet, exercise type of like accounts on Instagram, things like that. Just trying to make it interesting. try making it interesting. Once you do that, um, once you grab the reader's attention, you explain why this paper is important. So why do you think this topic is worthy of our attention? Why I, as a reader, should spend my time reading your article? So you explain like the rise of influencers, the importance they're having over the life of like younger generations, the amount of money being spent by the industry on advertising. You can talk about like different brands and what successes they've had. And so if this phenomena has implications financially, socially, psychologically, you name it, then it's worthy of our investigation as academic researchers. That's what the authors try to do in the introduction section. Okay? So you have to establish like this is an important matter to discuss. And I also only gave one example, but you can think of different topics. So remember when we talked about, let's say, the effects of video games on a feeling of loneliness, right? So video games, say, yeah, you want to investigate if video games decrease the feeling of loneliness, especially online multiplayer video games. Then why is that important? Well, you can point out to the pandemic and the effect of pandemic on mobility and not being able to socialize, so with social distancing and whatnot, which then explain the rise or like the spike in the rates for like downloading video games and engagement of video games in terms of like length of hours per day. Then yeah, if this you would show this is a worldwide phenomena, and then understanding the effects would help us in understanding where this social phenomena is going from, like the implication of this. Okay. So you grab the attention, you explain why the topic is important, and then the purpose of the paper. So the purpose of the paper, you would then say, my article or our proposed study will look into specific things, right? So you cannot study everything about multiplayer online games. You will only look at very specific component of that. So one specific outcome variable. So we said like depression or loneliness, pick one or two, and then one type of like video games. So you're talking about like video games where people can go online and play in groups, rather than any game at all, right? So this is and how your poll paper is going to be adding to this topic. So that's the introduction. As for literature review, which is more detailed than introduction. So the introduction, by the way, in academic articles can take like a page, page and a half, 2 pages max. That's it. Literature review can take plenty of space, like ranges from 2 pages to 6 pages to 8 pages, depending on how many components or variables you're studying. So literature review are considered the foundation of the research, like the theoretic, and sometimes it's called the theoretical development section. And when we say a foundation, that means based on the literature review, all the following sections will be built upon it. That is to say, what you explain in the literature review, going to introduce what your proposal is going to be in terms of the theoretical explanation you're giving, in terms of the direction of the relationship you're proposing, things like that. So you're saying that my literature review, if you're studying the effects of video games, online video games on loneliness, right? Online group video games of loneliness. You then say, here's what the previous research on loneliness have shown, And here's the theories that show why loneliness leads people to play more video games. So he explained the mechanisms, like why we see this link. Based on that lecture review, everything else you do in terms of like whether you're running a survey or an experiment, it has to follow from the lecture review you're proposing. We're going to talk more in details about this, but to give you the academic definition of literature review, so it's a systematic, explicit, and reproducible method for identifying, evaluating, and interpreting the existing body of recorded work in academic domain. So to dissect that statement, systematic and explicit meaning you explicitly cited some articles, some previous research. You went about it systematically. That is to say, you went through the major pieces or the major works or the major journals that dealt with this topic, and you reviewed them one by one. So not necessarily you would review every single article about a topic. That's almost impossible. But you looked into the most important ones. But you did not neglect an important one that has a different viewpoint. Right? So that's what means systematic and explicit. And it's reproducible because anyone could look at the same research. So literature review, you actually look at published research. So published in what I explained before, like academic peer-reviewed journal articles. You cannot rely on articles you've done yourself before that no one has ever read, right? Because that's not considered like a peer-reviewed work that people can look back to and compare to their results. So you look into publishing. And so by academic domain, they mean whatever topic you're studying. So if you're studying mobile use, you're studying video games, you're studying a romantic relationship, you're studying persuasion, you're studying political advertising, you name it. Whatever that subtopic you're investigating, you're going to review the literature around that subtopic. So that's what they mean by an academic domain. So who writes literature review? Well, academic researchers, obviously. So you want to demonstrate your knowledge, the fact that you've done your homework regarding the academic topic. So when I talk about the effect of mobile phone use on sleeping, I have to demonstrate that I'm knowledgeable about the topic. So I've read the major literature. I know the work that has been done, right? I also initiate my research questions in the literature review. And that is to say, by showing what has been done, you get a sense of what needs to be done then, right? So if you mention that mobile phone use has been linked to like poor sleep quality, then we need to investigate that further. So what's about mobile phones that's causing sleep deprivation? And then you reveal, related to that, reveal holes or what we would call gaps in the literature. So what things have caused, what things the previous research have discovered, and what things previous research has yet to discover. And to give you an example, so for those of you who were here on Friday or watched the Friday lecture, we discussed, so I and students discussed the study on mobile phone use, the people who use their phones before going to bed or before going to sleep while they are on bed actually report poorer sleeping quality in overall. However, so that's a finding previous research has established. However, in our discussion, if you remember, we did not know, or the research did not tell us what exactly about cell phones that's causing that. So is it about the mental stimulation? So you browse social media you're having that fear of missing out. You're curious about what other people are doing, so you just keep thinking about that. So you're not putting your mind into rest, right? So that's the one explanation. Another explanation we said it could be about like the light coming out of the cell phone screen, and probably you know the things about the blue light or like the blue shift thing when you can turn it off. You put a night mode. Some cell phones have that, right? So the theory is that degree of light alerts some parts of your brain that is concerned with attention and rest, and so you're basically not allowing the attention parts of your brain to deactivate or to hibernate. Okay? So if you're doing those questions, the previous research have not addressed. Hence, my research will try to address, right? So I am relying right on previous research, but in a way to address the gaps that previous research has not uh, filled. Similarly, actually, so lecture review, even if they're not called by that name, um, are actually conducted all the time. So we just call it secondary research. So I'm sure you heard that phrase before, secondary research. Have you heard, who has heard that phrase before, secondary research? So Lara, do you know what secondary research is?
Yeah, like a lot of times when you're doing a research paper, you can have like a primary source, so it like comes from that period, or you can have a secondary source, which is like the research that's done by people who are considered like experts in that field.
Right. So primary research, you do the research, i.e. you collect the data, which you would need to do. But before that, you do the secondary research. And I know it's sort of counterintuitive because you do the secondary research first and the primary research second. And so it's the same thing in academics, similar to even in history books, right? Even if you're investigating a topic yourself, let's say, for instance, that's a good one. So if you're covering politics, like so if you're covering what Congress been doing, you're writing a book about it, right? Like with the COVID and whatnot, you're going first to look at the history of what has happened. So that would be called secondary research. What previous bills Congress has explored, what reactions previous Congress bodies or presidencies have done, like in reaction to past pandemics or past economic downturns, things like that. That's what we would call secondary research. And the reason you do secondary research is to inform you about how to conduct your primary research. Right? So even if you're a journalist, if you're a historian, if you're a marketing strategist, if you're an event planner, you name it, you look at past events in order to inform you how to conduct or like plan for future events. Okay? Um, and so, yeah, assuming you work in strategic communication, that is to say, you end up working in advertising, PR, community relations, you name it, right? Whatever policy or strategy you're discussing, you have to demonstrate that the ideas you're proposing are based somewhat on previous research. So that could be previous case studies, could be previous primary research articles that investigated a phenomena. It could be something the same organization has done in the past, and you think we ought to replicate it because the contexts are similar. Think of that. So whatever something you're trying to add, it has to be built on someone proven effective in the past. So yeah, you're proposing a strategy of like you work in a company, or like for you work in an agency and for a client, and you tell them, you know what, you should change the packaging color from blue to red. Well, why should we do that change? Can I just say, well, because that's what I prefer? You have to say, you have to show some research showing, well, actually, that color is associated with these meanings according to research. Therefore, if your brand wants to change its perception of it, has to make this change. Like, and I gave color only as an example, but you can think about like color, fonts, packaging, about even if you talk about different audiences, right? Uh, what research have you read that showed us like we should target millennials instead of baby boomers? Why would that be beneficial to us? And what's your evidence for it? So, in order to show some evidence, you conduct secondary research. In academia, we call secondary research literature review. We're talking about academic research. So that's the difference. Um, so yeah, the reasons for conducting literature review then is to show credibility. And so if you go up discussing any topic, you should show the audience that you've done your homework and done the enough reading about it. So you don't come up talking about specific topic without knowing the most like up to date research on that topic, right? So to give you a very recent example, no one, for instance, if you are one of these physicians or virologists talking about COVID, you cannot come up in an interview without reading about the new variants that are coming up, right? Like the one in South Africa, like about the new vaccines by Johnson and Johnson. You have to stay up to date because whatever medical research has been done in the last 3 weeks could append whatever you know before that, right? So in order to show us, imagine we are viewers and you're the expert, you have to show us that you're reading the news, you've read the new things that came out. You're up to date. You know about most of the new developments. You know the ins and outs of research being conducted. You know about the major theories or explanation of what's happening. So we get credibility, right? But imagine in that interview, you see someone interviewing a virologist. Let's say the anchor asked them about the new South African, the new variant or mutation from South Africa, and then the experts say, "What is that? I didn't hear about it." That basically matches the credibility of that person. But similarly, when you're writing something, you have to show that you have the most up-to-date information regarding that topic. Um, and even when you do that, you're informing and educating your readers about it. So someone reading your article is not only reading about your very specific hypotheses, but they got a general overview of what the research, the level of research that's been done regarding this topic. So to give examples from what we've discussed, uh, so Emily, just gonna ask you a question. Do you remember what did you post on the discussion board for the recent articles?
Yeah, I did how like kids are being affected by screen time during like the COVID pandemic.
Yes. And what did that article say?
It was saying how like kids are building up this reliance on screen time and that scientists are worried that once like the pandemic is over that kids are not going to be able to go back to being like normal kids and playing outside because they're reliant on screens now.
Right, right, right. So the pandemic has created an over reliance by kids on smartphones or like smart devices. But we all know that that thing or this phenomenon, this trend, did not start with the pandemic, right? People have been talking about if you just talk to your mother or one of your aunts or something or father, you would, I'm sure you heard that complaint before, like kids those days cannot leave their iPads, right? So if you're running this research about the pandemic, you have to point out to the research about kids' attachment to smart devices in general. Like what has been done on that? Has anyone discovered like the mental effects of it, the social effects? The some are arguing it could even harm the communicative or the communication skills of kids because they're not socializing enough. They can only communicate via the chat section of whatever game they're playing. So they lacking some social skills. This is just one argument, right? So what research has been done on that? On top of that, you do the research on the effects of pandemic or isolation on stress and depression among kids and among adults, and you link them together and see, okay, here's where I see this is going, right? So even if you're setting a new context or an emerging phenomena, the roots of it is not that totally new. There must be something that could inform us about the specific context of the pandemic and kids' reliance on smartphones. Yes, Jennifer, what do you want to ask?
Okay, sorry. So I was just kind of like thinking about what you were saying and how I could apply it. So when you're saying that because I was thinking as you were giving the information and say you're the expert and you're the researcher and me as the audience would feel like you lost your authority if you didn't know about some new up-to-date research. If one of the reporters asked you, oh, well, what about this other research that's been going on? And so then we, as the audience, then we lose, like, we don't believe that you are credible anymore because it's like, because the audience feels like I already knew that. So if I knew that, then they don't even know what I know. They're just going to jump to, they don't know as much as me. So, and then I was thinking also, like, if somebody asked alternative in the other case with the smartphones and the tablets. So if somebody wants to say, well, what about this other research that this other person is doing? And they're saying that it's healthy to have a good balance and that going forward, we should stick to more online and maybe think about changing the way we do academics and start, saying whatever. So is it up to us as the researchers to like know what opposing views are also? And what do you do when you're confronted and it's like, at what limit is it that you lose authority of the most up-to-date information? Or, because it's kind of like by the time you write something and then by the time it gets reviewed and goes out, there's going to be something different. But that doesn't mean I didn't know what I was talking about at that point. So how do we put that into our like writing?
Okay, those are excellent questions, and so let me answer them one by. So yeah, the part about the credibility. So yes, so it is your job as the researcher to find the most recent research, even the opposing views, and that doesn't mean like you will find like some articles in a super obscure journal somewhere in the corner of the internet that have some opposing views. But if we're talking about like, let's say the major journals about in any field, so in any field you go, so in or even subfield. So I personally, I do like advertising research. So I know mostly what happened in advertising journals and I do some evolutionary psychology, so I know the research on that. So in these topics, I focus a lot. So if I am going to discuss any topic related to those two things, I pretty much have to make sure that I don't do research that has not, I don't proclaim something that has not been investigated before. So if I claim something and there's research that shows the opposite, I don't have the choice to just ignore it. I actually have to discuss it. If I disagree, and you can disagree even with empirical research, by the way, you can say then, yeah, like here's what this article has shown, but let me tell you why these findings do not apply to my context. Or like they have unique circumstances that lead to these specific findings. But based on that other research, which is more overwhelming, I think this thing I'm discussing will go into that other direction, right? So yeah, even to stick with the example Emily gave, yes, so even if we're discussing, yes, some research showing cell phones, like reliance on cell phones help with depression for kids. Then you ask, well, how did they find cell phone use? Was it used for addiction? What type of apps that the kids were relying on? So it could be that there's some platforms that are healthier, or maybe there are some cases where it might facilitate social interaction, but it has to be coupled with social interactions. So things like that, right? So you work really hard to add nuance into the phenomenon. And that's what the literature review is all about, right? So you take a general overview. Sometimes you see mostly uniform views. A lot of time you see divergent views or contrasting views, and you need to synthesize. You read enough, you take your position, and then you defend it, similar to how you argue any case. That's the
Okay.
first one.
So follow up with that one. Okay, so we do need to put some effort into looking into opposing views. So we just like most of our effort into the expert of what our topic is, and some time on researching other topic, or having like opposing views, I guess. Like split up the research time. Okay.
Yeah, if you research it, that's your job. And that's similar to like about the credibility, right? So I personally experienced what you're saying. So I write an article, I send it out for publication, and by the time it gets published, there's already new research coming out. So that's fine. Like editors understand that. But I've been, for instance, into, let's say you go into a conference with people who used to go to conferences. And then especially when you're talking about with other experts, and this apply, by the way, even outside academia. So whatever profession you all go into, you go into a boardroom meeting even, you cannot talk about one topic that everybody in the room is an expert on without knowing what you're talking about, right? Like talking about stock trading, and if you have not been following the latest news, yeah, you're out of the loop. Like you have to be up to date, because if you make a grave mistake, or like you forgot something that happened last week and people have already adjusted their plans towards, then yeah, you technically look like someone who's not done their homework. And yeah, you're right to be blamed for that, actually, rightly so. So yeah, that what you asked about is exactly what the literature review is all about. So establishing your credibility, informing the audience of what the most up-to-date research is at, and then from the contrasting views, you make the argument of what your proposal is going to be. So I hope that.
Thank you.
So here's So here's an example. So let's say we have you working now for the state of California. They hired your agency or firm, and so probably you've heard like what happened at the Dodger Stadium in LA. Like some people were harassing others who want to take vaccination. Like some anti-vaxxers, like pushing people away from the vaccine centers. And so let's say the state of California wants to run a campaign addressing that hostility or skepticism towards the COVID-19 vaccine. So they want to convince people who are skeptical to sign up or to consider taking the vaccine. So now you're tasked with that. What are you going to do, right? So how should the state run the campaign? So is it going to be mostly an online campaign, an offline campaign, a broadcast media campaign? Are you sending activists in the streets? Are you deploying like social workers or medical professionals? How are you going to run this campaign, right? How much money are you going to put into that campaign? So how much is needed? Which channels are you going to use? So are you going into like YouTube, Facebook, Twitter? Are you doing TV, radio, billboards? Are you doing all of the above? What channels are you doing? Right? How are you going to target? So are you going to talk directly to people who are skeptical about vaccines? How do you find them? So are you going to make micro-targeted campaigns on social media? Or are you running public service announcements on TV that talks about the effects? And most importantly, what's the message going to be? Like, are you saying, hey, the vaccine is good, please take it? Like, yeah, it's too good to be true, right? There should be like some messaging strategy or a creative way to overcome hostility or skepticism, right? So how are you or how am I, as someone working in strategic communication, answer any of these questions? And the answer is you cannot answer any of these questions unless you do research. So that's what we mean by the need to do secondary research. It's to say, well, I would look into previous campaigns against anti-vaxxers and what they have achieved. So again, so skepticism towards vaccines has been with us for decades. Like, and it's been a struggle for public health officials. But it goes up and down in terms of like the intensity. But some people try to address these problems before, like in different states, in different countries, in different eras. And so if I'm doing a campaign in the state of California in the year 2021, I should not start from scratch. Like, I should look into these case studies. So what does the research say about anti-vaccine skepticism? Like, what's the psychological motive for that? What are the demographic characteristics of people who are into that type of stuff, right? What did change them before? So if we know of a campaign that was actually successful in converting people to be more pro-vaccine, what did these campaigns do? What type of incentives did they provide? What type of messaging? Was it like they used like storytelling? Have they used some different mechanisms like in terms of the content itself? So they used other videos that simplified the matter to them? How did they make the issues relevant to the audience? There's a lot of questions into that, right? And the only way to find them is you look into previous research, previous case studies that didn't exactly study the same exact incident. So it's not necessarily about COVID-19 in the year 2021, but any other virus or any other epidemic before, or any other public health campaign. So you take that, and from those instances, you draw some lessons. And from those lessons, you devise a strategy for the new or the emerging case you have at hand. So in that point, clear so far, like what's the value of this when you apply it to a new company? So yeah, that's to summarize, you could rely on previous case studies. It won't tell you everything you would need to know about the current environment because always there's some different in context. But based on what's already exists, you could suggest the piece that you're going to add, right? So you say, yeah, these campaigns worked non-COVID disease before, and here's the how my research is going to show you how it's applied to the COVID situation, things like that, right? So here's some like, this is a long detailed summary. I won't go into this one by one, so because we have already discussed most of them. But yeah, in the literature review, we explain what the research problem is. You show new lines of inquiry or the most up to date. And one reason, yeah, that is important that you do literature review is you avoid fruitless projects. And that is to say, if a topic has already been investigated, what's the need to investigate it again? So remember, when you do research, you're not exactly replicating the same topics that someone else has done, but you're adding some nuance. So you're either trying in a different context, different sample, different demographic, you're adding an additional variable, and so forth, so forth. So by doing that, by showing what already has been done, you're showing that, okay, my research has some value because it's adding something. And that's the mere replication of another thing. And then by looking into different and opposing point of views, you can synthesize where you think your hypothesis is going to be. So that's the major function of research. Here is some example. So let's see what. So we have, yeah. So we can actually do this on Wednesday. But before, because I want to do this before our class ends. So let me talk about assignment number 1 now, and then we can go back and talk about let's review, okay? Because it's actually relevant. So if you could please go to Blackboard and click on the link for assignment 1. So it's already been posted, and I'm going to share the screen for it. All right. So as you can see, I've already, so first of all, the instructions are all in the Google Doc and link to. And then the articles, you don't have to look up for articles yourself. You actually just need to pick one of these 4 articles. So when you type down your assignment, just tell me, okay, I picked article number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. Then I would know what it is. They are, as you can see, attached right here. So you pick whatever topic you feel more relevant to you. So that's the first thing. Secondly, the questions I'm asking in assignment 1 is precisely what we've been discussing so far about literature review. So here, like, again, so the point is to show what the rationale or like why the authors think the research is important, what's the gap between what the previous research has done and what yet to be done, and finally, what theories or theoretical frameworks or concepts that the authors have utilized in their research. So let me go like over the questions one by one. So you need to answer these questions right here, 5 questions. So first one is, in plain term, what is this research all about? So this one you could just tell by reading the title and the abstract. You don't really need to go beyond that. So for question number 1. So what the topic is, but just explain it in like an everyday language. So if you see some like, so you can see like right here, mobile media used by infants and toddlers, tell us what they did. Like they research this has an effect on that, right? And if there's some complicated terms, you just need to explain it in plain terms. That's it. So just by reading the articles and abstract, you should be able to answer this part. Study importance, you get this from the introduction section. The authors would typically tell you why this topic is worth investigation, like what new trends happen in reality, like, or like some new numbers about kids and like smartphone use, or like about what topics are here, like, yeah, like cooperative video games and aggressive behavior. So like why we need to study cooperative video games. So they would tell you in the introduction, like here, like the increase in numbers of people playing video games of all ages. Hence, it's an important topic. So in the introduction, this most of the cases it would be stated explicitly, like like this increase in the share of like games led us to investigate this topic. So, or like something along these lines. So the authors would tell you why they think the study is important and you should pay attention to it, right? So this is just from the introduction section. In the literature review, however, and like I would say 3 and 5 are the most important questions, as you could see by the weight given to them. The authors would cite previous articles that has done similar research. Could you summarize a few of them? So only like 3. You don't have to have a thorough review of the literature review. You don't have to conduct your own research just from the articles you're reading. What citations or what findings they have cited. So whether it's about smartphone addiction, whether it's about violent video games, whatever topic the article is talking about. What previous articles have they cited, like as the major findings that has informed their own research? And based on that, what was missing? So in every article you read, there's always something about what has been done. So there are articles for like the effect of soundtrack music, but the missing part would be something specific to video game experience. So what were the articles that have already been, what were the topics that we already have published articles on, and what's the new like, concept or variable that this research paper is adding to that piece, right? So that's number 3. Number 4, so look at the variables. Some of them would be material, and I meant by material, I wish I could find a better word. Like I meant directly observed, so something that you can look into and measure directly. And some are conceptual or theoretical. What are those articles, and can you define them for us? So this is also you can find in the literature review what the definitions are. So if you look right here, so we have the effects of soundtrack music on the video game experience. Does anyone need a definition of what soundtrack music is? Like, I think it's pretty much straightforward, right? But when you're talking about video game experience is something more emotional, right? So it's not talking about video games playing, in terms of time or like the type of video games, like experience, like how people are experiencing it. So you need to define how the authors define game experience. And so they would basically explicitly state that in the literature review. So that's it. So what's the components in that the investigation has in that article, and you define them for us if they were vague or conceptual. And then number 5, what's the main hypotheses or research question? So that you will find sometimes that has to be stated explicitly in the literature review. So sometimes you would see like a subheading H1 standing for hypothesis 1, and then they will state what the hypothesis is. You just copy that if it's the case. Or sometimes in the body of the same like a paragraph of the article, you would see the author saying, "We hypothesize that," and then they will mention something. Then that's going to be the hypothesis. Or research questions if they don't have a hypothesis. So based on what you read in 3, you can actually answer number 5. If they put hypotheses, how are they logically linked to the previous studies? So in other words, previous studies have found about these two contexts, but that context, we don't know yet enough about it. Therefore, the authors proposed this research question. So something simple as that. So just link it back to whatever you've written in section 3 or question number 3. And if it's a research hypothesis, then say how the research hypothesis is logically linked to previous research. So in other words, if we here, for instance, influence of, let's say, solitary and cooperative violent video games and aggressive and pro-social behavior. So what previous research has shown in terms of the effect of cooperative violent video games, and then why the authors thought that that relationship would be positive or negative, depending on what the author says. So yeah, like violent video games had that effect in previous research in one context, and the authors proclaim that in this context, it should also have a similar effect, right? Because it has the same dynamic or mechanism. So yeah, if you answer question 3, question 5 should be easier. So what's the claim or the hypothesis, and how this hypothesis is related to the previous research? So yeah, you don't need to, by the way, this is not meant to be a thorough summary of the article, just directly and as succinctly as possible, answer the questions I'm asking. And that should be it for the article. So it should not take more than like a page and a half. If you could do it in a page, that would be fine. So if you answer the questions directly and sufficiently, you didn't need to worry about the links at all, right? So maximum, this should not take more than 2 pages if you want to elaborate. Yeah, and you can see the template right here. So you could just fill this up and that will be it. And you can see the grading breakdown as well, like how many points per which question. So yeah, that's it. You have any questions? So finally, my advice to you that if you starting this summit, it's due Friday. So if you start doing it, things will make sense, and you will then have more specific questions. So I'm free to answer specific questions, like on Wednesday and on Friday, and during office hours, and by email. So yeah, please start it ASAP, and so we can then discuss specific questions for each student. And to remind you, you don't have to do all of the individual assignments. So remember, we have 6, and you only need to do 4 of them. So you have to do 2 assignments for 10 points and 2 assignments for 15 points. This is one of the 10 points assignments. So yeah, if you plan to do it, you don't need to tell me, just do it and submit. If you don't plan to, then just skip it, and then, but keep in mind you need to do another 4, right? So just want to remind everyone of that. And yeah, so if no one has any question or want to discuss anything, yeah, then I'll just say goodbye. Well, yeah, take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor? Hi there.
Hi, Jasmine.
Hi. So I was wondering if there was a way I could add my name to the attendance sheet, like the Google Doc. I know I wasn't